Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this podcast where we'll be discussing compensation, culture, and competition, and how firms are responding to the intense competition in the lateral market, both in the US and the UK at the moment. But for me, the real question is a really practical one. How are firms keeping the partners who really drive their business without damaging the partnership culture that they're trying to build amongst this very intense competition around compensation at the moment? And this question is becoming much more difficult because the lateral market is putting firms under real pressure. The compensation isn't just about reward, it's also kind of tied up with the strategy of the firm, its culture, and of course, increasingly the way it's governed. And the risk, of course, is in that the firms try to solve one retention issue or the ability to kind of retain and recruit people and end up creating a much bigger partnership issue, particularly if pay becomes far too kind of reactive to competition or too individualized or even too opaque. That's why the US and UK comparison here is quite useful. Markets are really these markets are really connected. What the US law firms are doing is clearly having a huge impact on the UK headquartered firms here in London around being able to retain and recruit high flying partners. But the economics and the legal framework and the partnership assumptions are not always the same on both sides of the pond. So I want us really to focus in this session on the practical question, not simply whether firms can afford to compete, but whether they can compete in a way that still supports their culture, their governance, and their partnership model. So I'm really delighted to be joined today by Lisa Smith and David Fisher. Lisa is a founding principal of Fairfax Associates, and she heads up its Washington office. Lisa spent more than 35 years advising leading law firms, both in the US and the UK and globally, on strategy, growth, mergers, and management and governance, partner compensation and structure, and financial performance. She brings exactly the right kind of US market perspective for this conversation, not just on what firms are paying, but on how compensation itself is being used as part of the wider strategy for growth. And my fellow partner at CM Murray, David Fisher, brings the UK perspective, particularly on the partnership, governance, and the legal protections that sit behind some of these decisions and the issues that determine whether compensation reform, lateral hiring, and retention strategies actually work in practice. And by way of brief introduction to myself, I'm Zulon Begum. I'm a partner at CM Murray as well. I advise law firms and professional services firms on partnership governance, partner exits, team moves, and strategic change. So I see these issues not just as a kind of an abstract issue in the market trends, but as a live kind of boardroom and partnership question that firms are having to grapple with in real time. So we would like this to be really practical, not just what firms are paying, but what are they trying to protect? What behaviors are they rewarding? And what are the unintended consequences around some of these issues? So I really want to start with the discussion with the obvious point. Of course, money matters, but the more interesting question is whether the compensation will still follow the strategy and whether in some firms it has started to drive some of those strategic decisions. And I want to come to you, Lisa, first, because I'm really interested to hear about your perspective, particularly advising in the US legal market and across the pond as well. What has really changed in the way firms are thinking about partner compensation in this market at the moment?
Yeah, I think to put it maybe overly dramatically, almost everything. I think compensation for partners has become more of a pain point for firms and are having to, even firms that have had long-standing compensation systems with limited change, have had to revamp their compensation approaches. So I think we see this being very much a top of mind issue in firms in a way that it hasn't been in the past, and including some of the most profitable firms. And Zulon, as you point out, a lot of that is driven by the lateral movement. The lateral movement over the last just between 24 and 25 was up 20% in terms of partner moves within the MLaw 200, which are the 200 largest firms by revenue that are based in the US. And And I think that's really changed the game. And firms are having to respond to that. And firms that never lost laterals or lost partners before are losing partners, some, on a almost daily basis. And 2026 doesn't show any slowing of that lateral movement. So I think it's forced firms to think about it in a couple of ways. One is, how do they keep their partners and, more importantly, the clients sticky? And so I think that's something that firms are focusing on in terms of how to team on clients, so that a client can't just walk out the door with a single partner or even with a group. But that is, and then how do you also encourage collaboration generally, and pitching in teams and those kinds of things. And to some extent, those things are in conflict with what they're having to do on partner comp, which is focused more on the individual performance in order to retain their top talent. So I think that's a key strategic issue that many of the US firms are facing right now.
So are we kind of now in the space where compensation traditionally, especially in firms in the UK, who might still be using some kind of lockstep system, that compensation is often kind of a reward for past contribution as well as current and future, but it's now becoming much more a defensive weapon to stop partners walking out of the door?
Yeah, I'd say it's much more of a, what have you done for me lately kind of approach. And partners are impatient. Young successful partners are impatient. They want to move up the ladder more quickly. The senior lawyers are typically no longer willing to essentially take less pay in order to push money down the ladder. And so that's creating some tensions within the firms. And because of the lateral market, and there's even a premium in the lateral market, people can pick up and take their business elsewhere and get paid for that. So it's putting pressure to sort of shift that historic slow up, slow down sort of mentality that firms, even without a pure lockstep, firms often had a sort of concept of gradualism, which is, you would pay your dues on the way up, you would be rewarded at the top, and you would have a slow decline. That is under pressure. We don't see very many firms able to do that anymore, and so it's become a more faster up, faster down, and in some cases faster out. Firms are having to manage out partners who aren't sort of performing at a level that matches the income. And that's been pushed by just overall profitability. If you look at of course, the profitability of firms, the AmLaw 50 firms over the last 6 years, the profitability overall has increased about 70%. So the numbers are eye-popping. And so even somebody who is performing at the same level that they did, 4 or 5 years ago, could be grossly underpaid or grossly overpaid because the value of their point level or their unit level has gone up so much. And if their performance hasn't gone up much, they'll be overpaid relative to the peers who have bumped up their performance.
Yeah, some of the numbers being bandied around in the US firms are eye-popping, I have to say.
Yes. And you have to be careful with those. Some of the, yes, I'm sure there are some $40 million partners. That's the number that seems to be the current eye-popping number, but it's not the majority.
It's interesting the point you make about the lockstep, and obviously the premise of the lockstep, whether it's there are very few pure lockstep firms here in the UK left, but a lot of firms still use some kind of modified lockstep system. But the principle behind it is that there's jam tomorrow. If you work hard, you will you'll reap the rewards in a few years' time. But it's now the principle seems everybody wants to have jam today.
Yes.
David, now that firms are having to move, think about compensation much more aggressively and give people more jam today, where do you think that's kind of creating tensions in partnerships around that at the moment?
Yeah, so certainly pick up on what Lisa was saying. I think a lot of instances of firms looking to push partners out just in order to maintain profitability levels. I think that's happening, seeing that more and more. And I think that certainly brings about a good deal of potential conflict. And there's a lot of unfairness seen in this as well. Maybe whereas at one time, as you're saying, someone may have performed well over a good level over a series of years. It may be that there's now, let's say, just a dip in a particular year, possibly due to circumstances that they can't really control. But I think there's a lot more pressure now on firms to be pushing partners out in those sorts of circumstances. And many firms have very broad powers to remove partners for whatever reason they really see fit, if it's in the interests of the firm, and if the structure of the firm and if its members' agreement has been put together in the right way. It can be just very simple for the senior leadership in a firm to make the decision really to push partners out. And there's often very little that partners can do to resist that. But I think seeing certainly a good bit more of that these days, and also just involvement in disputes over the way that compensation is determined, where it's not just sort of set purely by points, but where there's a degree of discretion in the way that remuneration is determined. People looking to challenge the way that that's done, a seeming sort of sense of unfairness, not necessarily in what they're being paid individually, but it's the classic case of sensing that someone else is actually being paid more than they are. Certainly our partners are getting quite upset about that and trying to look for ways to challenge the process. But that's often very difficult because, as we know, in lots of firms, the process for determining compensation is very clouded. So right for disputes in lots of these sorts of situations. I don't see it changing anytime soon, really.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, when I, advising on compensation reviews and deeds, I mean, one of the key conversations with the client will be around how they beef up their performance management process in their partnership deed or partner performance process policy, because that, as you say, David, you need to protect that profitability pool for the high performance, and you can't really in this kind of environment, you can't really kind of carry some of the underperformance that you might have carried historically, but you need to have the right tools within your constitutional armory in order to deal with that underperformance and ultimately, if needed, to de-equitize people or even exit them. So you need to have the kind of constitutional levers to do that.
That's right, and I think as well, just with that, I think it's probably no different from the way it is with employees in many businesses. If performance isn't managed at the right time, if people aren't given the right messages about the fact that they are underperforming and that there's some improvement needed, it can come as a bit of a shock the way down the line when suddenly someone who thought they were doing perfectly fine and hadn't been challenged on anything is suddenly being told it's just not good enough anymore and you're on your way out. So certainly these things need to be tackled sooner.
And that's something that law firm partnerships tend to be less good at with the partners. They're very good at those performance messages and advancement messages with associates, but when you get to the partner level, there's less frequent feedback, if any, and partners are expected to be owners of the business as opposed to being employees that are getting those feedback messages. So that often is a surprise to partners that somehow they are underperforming.
Absolutely. So let's have a think about how firms are actually adapting compensation systems in practice. So what are you seeing, Lisa, in the firms that you're advising? Are we seeing higher? I mean, we hear of these, huge numbers of guaranteed amounts being offered by US firms to lure people over. Is that still a thing? Are there guaranteed payments? And I myself am seeing, especially for the UK firms who are trying to adapt compensation systems to react to especially the US firms luring their people, is kind of moving more to less profit away from the lockstep and more into a discretionary performance pool that gives them management more ability to pay people, especially the high flyers who might be at flight risk. And that kind of thing. So what is it you're seeing in the US firms at the moment around changes
Yeah,
changes in
I
the
think in
compensation?
terms of the actual comp structures, I do think there's a couple of key things. One is stretching assuming it's a point-based system, and something like 70 to 80% of at least the AmLaw 100 firms do use a point or unit or level system where those points and units vary depending on firm profitability. They're stretching those. So there's now it's more common to have some super points at the top of the band for the superstar performers, or to just increase the range overall so that the ratio from top to bottom is stretching. It's not uncommon to see 15-1 ratios from the top to the bottom of the compensation range just within the equity partnership. The other is, as you point out, is the bonus. So bonus pools are getting larger. Individual bonuses are getting larger. And so bonus pools historically, some firms haven't had them at all. And those who have, it was maybe 5 to 8% of distributable income would be put into a bonus pool. Now we're seeing those go more in the 8 to 12% range, sometimes even 15 or 20% bonus pools. So much more is on a discretionary basis, and just the discretionary pool tends to reward the most recent year. So it's more of a retroactive look at the past year as opposed to the points and units, which are prospective. So those are looking ahead. Those are being set at the beginning of the year for the coming year. The bonus it really focuses on the just past year performance. So it becomes much more and is more individually focused. So it does sort of drive that individual focus as opposed to team focus or firm focus in compensation. I think the other thing, and David, you touched on sort of some of the tensions that come up, not when people can be satisfied with their own compensation until they see what the person next door is making. And so we've seen a shift in transparency. So more firms are restricting access to the actual compensation schedule. And either it's completely closed or it's closed in that it's not pushed out to the partners, but they have to request it, or maybe even have to go to managing partner's office in order to just look at the schedule, and can't take it away, and so they can't do their kind of back of the envelope analysis of why they were paid what they were paid and somebody else was paid differently. And so I think that's been a direct response not only to that sort of relativity piece, but I think also to some of the packages that are being offered to laterals, and having less visibility into those. So those are a couple of the big changes that we're seeing.
That's really interesting. And I mean, in addition to the kind of tweaking the compensation system, what exactly are firms rewarding in terms of what are expectations of partners? Is it origination, or is it, focused around
Yeah,
growing relationships, or the way the team, AI has become a big thing. Is it kind of the way you deliver the work to the clients? Are any of those having an influence on what they're expecting of partners and how they're remunerated?
It's definitely become more metric driven. So more focus on the numbers, not in a formulaic way, but certainly when we do sort of the regression analysis on metrics versus compensation, we see very strong relationships between particularly origination, but with some of the other metrics as well. And firms are expanding the credits that they measure. And part of that is a response to trying to balance origination versus some of the other contributions that partners make to building relationships, particularly for large client relationships. There are people that are focused on the client service, on the proliferation of new matters. And so sort of measuring all of those things becomes important. Now, of course, partners have to believe that those metrics will, in fact, influence compensation in order to take them seriously. And origination is still a primary driver. But we do see firms looking at a broader set of inputs as they become more metric focused, and still looking at the qualitative factors. But the qualitative factors have become a little bit more, as one firm recently described it, it could stop you from going down, but it's probably not going to help you move up the ladder very much.
I mean, there's always that perennial question around origination, isn't there? Is it, you still see some firms giving origination credit to somebody who might have introduced a client 20 years ago, but has had little to do with them in that intervening period, but still enjoying that credit. Are firms kind of being much more focused around that as to how they reward people on an origination?
Well, I think they're being more focused about how they look at the credits and adjust those credits. So that sort of, the 20-year ago example is what we would refer to as a first touch. The first person who brought it in will keep the origination credit forever. Most firms have moved away from that, often because they're doing origination at the matter level. So a new matter comes in and you look at who brought that matter to the firm. And even at the client level, it will shift over time. So if the relationship has shifted to a different partner or set of partners, then the origination credit will shift. And I think the other thing that is a change is the sharing of credits. So we see much more sharing of credits, where to reward the team who is responsible and recognizing that, again, particularly for large relationships, it's more likely a team that is responsible for bringing in and maintaining and expanding a client, as opposed to just an individual partner. And that brings its own challenges in terms of having to have some guidelines and guardrails around how that origination sharing is going to work. And so we do see firms really focusing on even having examples of here's scenarios where this is how the credit would be shared in this scenario, to give partners some guidance on how that should work. But also they're having to provide some oversight to make sure that it's consistent across the firm. So when they are looking at the metrics, they've got confidence that if there is origination sharing or credit sharing more generally, that it's being done consistently. And particularly for large firms, I mean, it's one thing in a mid-sized firm to be able to get behind the numbers, and firms always say they get behind the numbers. But when you're talking about a couple thousand lawyer global firm, it's a little harder to get behind the numbers, and so the numbers need to be as close to accurate as possible.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And you would think that things like AI would help with kind of data gathering. So they would hope that there'd be much more information available to management these days, given all the systems and the tools that we have. David, I want to come back to you. And obviously the things we're seeing on both sides of the pond seems to be much more of a move to individualized compensation, and focus on rewarding the star rainmakers, etc. Where do you see that becoming destabilizing for partnerships and causing kind of disputes, or causing people to leave? And how can firms, do you think, address those issues?
Yeah, I think there's perhaps a tendency for there to be perhaps a good degree of animosity in cases where there's a sort of sense of maybe sort of greater competition over the work, or who gets the credit for the work, or those sorts of things, where there's maybe a little bit more friction, or well, that's probably putting it mildly actually in terms of friction, but where there's perhaps less unity amongst teams or departments, where there seemed to be a sort of greater degree of competition because of the way that remuneration is determined. I mean, I think that's always been the case, that there'll be partners who are dissatisfied, even in a sort of traditional pay system where there's a sort of feeling if there are people doing the work and they're not the ones who are receiving the pay for it. But I do sense that there's a chance of sort of greater sort of falling out amongst sort of teams or partners where there's this sort of different approach to remuneration this way. Often as well, it's just sort of a question about people really knowing and understanding how remuneration is determined. I think there's just a feeling of everything just sort of being so vague, and lacking in transparency, and that can lead to its own issues, particularly where we're looking at maybe allegations that there might be some in the way of some sort of discrimination here between partners. I'm talking here about potential unlawful discrimination. Most usually that's sort of sex discrimination, partners sort of claiming that they are being undervalued, underpaid, usually because they're female rather than male. So that's something else that is I think a sort of tendency. Personally, not seeing too many actual claims pursued on that basis, but it certainly gives rise to a good degree of animosity and a suggestion that there is something of that nature behind the way in which pay is determined. So I think there are certainly problems there for firms to be aware of and things that need to be addressed. I think it is still a factor in many people sort of deciding to move on and look elsewhere.
I think the key things for firms and management teams to think about is if they do have a great deal of discretion, that they are exercising that discretion reasonably, and they, have proper reasons to back up why they're rewarding somebody more and somebody else less. And even if there is opacity about who's being paid what, that if push came to shove and they had to disclose remuneration decisions to the partners, that they're able to justify those decisions, and they shouldn't assume just because they have the benefit of opacity that nobody will ever see that decision-making process at all. So I think they need to have their ducks in a row if there was ever a kind of a dispute over anything like that.
Yeah, and that's a very fair point to make.
Yeah.
And that goes almost as much to people moving up as moving down, because if they're treating people moving down differently, that could also raise some issues if they're favoring somebody because they're a friend or a buddy or something like that. And so somebody is sort of staying where they are for much longer than they should have. That could also be seen as unfair.
Yeah, really good point. Thank you, Lisa. And I want to kind of come on to the other kind of key tensions and the impact that all of this is kind of driving on, particularly on kind of culture. And there is, every single law firm that I ever come across or advise, that one of their kind of key values will be we collaborate. We're very collaborative. But then is that if you kind of scratch beneath the surface and you think about their kind of compensation system and what behaviors they're effectively rewarding, you have to ask yourself whether that is the case, and is that really part of their culture? So I guess the question here, and I'll come back to you again, Lisa, as to whether can the compensation system, the changes that we're discussing at the moment that's going in the market, are they undermining things like culture and collaboration? Is that something that firms can still tout as being one of their values if based on the kind of compensation systems changes that they're making?
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things is that sometimes firms use culture or use collaboration and collegiality interchangeably, and they're not the same thing. So we see firms that are very collegial, partners can be very friendly with each other, but that doesn't actually mean they're working together on matters. So, which is really the collaboration side. And so I think there is sometimes some, collegial firms sometimes don't want to make the tough decisions, and they aren't pushing their partners. Collaborative firms really are focused on how do we work together to expand relationships, to grow the firm, to create new opportunities. And so I think that's an interesting difference in terms of, first, I think firms needing to recognize where they are on that spectrum of collegiality to collaboration. And culture is a funny one because it means different things to different firms. And does it mean excellence? Does it mean autonomy? And some partners really value that they have the autonomy to do what they want, make their decisions, decide what work level they want. And whereas others, are more focused on the culture being that of a hardworking, excellent firm. So there's culture really is a not ill-defined term, but it's a term that means a lot of different things to different firms. So I think in terms of how to encourage collaboration and use culture to do that, one of it is going back to sort of adding the different metrics is recognizing the different roles that partners play. That origination is bringing the client in the door is part of it, but expanding the relationship and providing excellent service and all the other things that need to happen in order to keep the client and expand the relationship, maybe different skill sets and maybe different people. So recognizing that a firm does require people with different skill sets and that those need to be rewarded. So it's not just the origination piece that matters. And I think some firms do that quite well, and really do look at the different roles that partners are playing on a matter and do focus on the teams, and ultimately recognize that expanding the work with existing clients is generally one of the easiest ways to drive revenue as opposed to going out and chasing new work. And so that there's high value in doing that and that that value should be rewarded.
I think the issue for firms is that they will often say they want kind of one firm behavior and collaboration and all of that, but the remuneration system is kind of actually paying for solo player behaviors. And there's a fundamental kind of misalignment between what they want to achieve in terms of culture versus what they're actually rewarding their partners for in terms of behavior. And from the individual's perspective, I mean, I think money will get you so far and it may attract you, but whether it will keep you in the long term, I think culture does play into that, because money doesn't necessarily fix where partners don't feel heard or they don't feel like they're being fairly treated, etc. So I think there is a strong element of culture as to whether people want to stay or move to a particular firm. But I think the combination of both financial and culture issues play into that, I think. So we talked about culture as being kind of both a push and pull factor in this for individual partners as to whether they stay or join firms. But I want to kind of delve into what other kind of push-pull factors are beyond money. What are the other kind of important things you think individuals are thinking about, Lisa, when they're deciding whether or not to move to a particular firm?
Yeah, I think there's quite a list, actually. Some of it is just if the need for depth in sort of the supporting practices. So if I'm a corporate partner and I need people in employee benefits and executive compensation or antitrust competition, or does my firm have enough depth in those specialties that allows me to compete for high-end work and deliver the high-end work? Some of it is just a recognition that if the work that I want to do is concentrated in a few firms and I'm not one of them and I'm tired of losing every pitch, I might decide to go to one of the market leaders where I can continue to do that work and not be sort of fighting it all the time. On the flip side, I think we do see rate pressures and partners in firms that are really pushing the billing rates up. Some partners are recognizing, again, the work they like to do and the clients they're working with may not support those rates. And so they'll move to a firm where the rate structure is more compatible. I think there's also a sort of second-class citizen dynamic in some practices where if it's a non-priority practice, say it's and we see this in some firms now that are emphasizing corporate and litigation may be pushed down in the priority. Firms the partners will say, well, I'm going to go to where my practice is the important one. And so we see some shifting as a result of that. And that also relates to sort of the conflict priority. So either either partners are hitting conflicts on a regular basis, or when there's business conflicts, they're usually on the losing end of the business conflict, as opposed to their practice being a priority in sort of in the conflict process. So I think those are some of the sort of more business side of the equation that comes into lateral moves, as much as I think pay and culture.
I mean, that point you make about practice priority is a really good one, in that we see huge growth in boutiques actually in London and in the UK, precisely because
in the US as well.
Yeah. So especially on the litigation, boutiques have been incredibly successful, and partners from the full service firms have gone on to establish or join very strong litigation boutiques or other kind of boutique areas. And that has driven a lot of growth in the market for those types of practices. The other kind of stark statistics you often see, I can't remember the exact numbers, but the number of lateral partners who actually leave within 5 years of joining a firm is pretty high. And I assume it's because of it may be because of, they get a better financial offer, but it's probably also down to the expectations around their platform or support or whatever it is, isn't met in the firm that they join, or the integration process hasn't really been very successful. And I do think there's an issue for the firms who are, especially if they're hiring a huge number of laterals, or they're not, they may be doing a lot of work in recruiting those people, but they're not doing the necessary legwork to ensure that those laterals are properly integrated. Often the pressure is all on the lateral themselves, isn't it? So they have their KPIs they need to meet by year 1 and year 2 and year 3. But actually, in order to do that, they need the support of their, the people in their team or the other partners around them. And often those partners don't have KPIs around supporting laterals integrate. David, where do you see the kind of difficulties that can arise out of those kind of effectively failed lateral hires?
I think clearly it's destabilizing where there's a regular turnover. People with lateral might arrive with a team of associates. It may be that they don't really sort of fit into the wider team all that well, because they sort of come in as a group and there's a sort of focus on getting established. And then if the lateral partner, if things don't work out, invariably they'll be looking to take their team with them again. We see that happening sort of quite a lot. There'll be a sort of core group of associates who want to move on with them. And I think that is quite destabilizing for the team of people who may have been there for quite some time, to see this sort of group come in, maybe sort of stir things up, be the sort of the shining stars in a way, and then just to sort of move on again. It'd be quite sort of dissatisfying for the ones who've been there some time and are sort of working away and trying to build things, building something at the firm.
When that happens a couple of times, then the partners in the firms say, well, why should I introduce my client to somebody who I think isn't going to be around for long? Because it opens it up potentially to somebody, the new lateral, taking that client in their next departure, or the clients themselves say, what's going on with the turnover in your firm? So I think that sometimes some, I don't know, PTSD that comes from having seen enough laterals come and go.
Yes, and I think as well. I mean, I think it can perhaps sort of lead to sort of teams being in silos a bit more as well, as I say, in that there's a tendency perhaps for other partners not to want to sort of start getting associates involved in it if they sort of see, well, hang on a minute, these associates are quite closely aligned with this other partner. What's going to happen to them in the future? Will they stay or will they go if this partner moves on again? And so I think it can lead to a lack of cohesion in an existing team.
Sometimes those groups are always thinking about what's their next exit strategy.
You do get people popping up every 2-3 years at different firms, don't you? But I would go back to
actually the guarantee period ends.
I would go back to actually having a very clear lateral hiring strategy in the first place. And I don't think that can be in isolation at the management board level. You need to bring in your practice area leads and partners within the particular teams and actually ask them to take ownership of any lateral hire, so that they're involved in that process in the first place, and they take ownership of integrating that lateral, so it becomes, again, as I said earlier, a two-way street between the firm and the partners in the firm helping lateral to integrate, as well as the lateral hire delivering on their promises.
Which then depends on the firms being realistic about what the laterals are going to deliver in the first place, because often they overpromise on the way in, and then are almost guaranteed to underdeliver, which can be frustrating.
And then it goes back to the due diligence the firm does on that individual as well when they're hiring. So going beyond what we've discussed at the moment, so what are the kind of UK firm responses? I want to talk a bit about how the UK firms have responded to the competition for laterals in terms of kind of their pay and their governance systems and the protections that they're implementing to protect in a defensive measure against their people being poached. So in my practice, I'm seeing a lot of the UK firms kind of taking a kind of both a carrot and stick approach to kind of protecting against laterals leaving their firm. So the carrot is ensuring that they have a clear career progression for their, both for the senior associates, their fixed share partner tier, and their equity. So having a clear a path for people to progress within the partnership and improve their remuneration as a result is really good. And having smarter compensation and some flexibility built in so that you are able to reward the high flyers without creating the kind of some of the tensions that we've discussed about. And we've talked about the kind of platform and support. I think there needs to be a really strong investment in those areas to make sure that partners feel like they've got the right platform and they're not looking elsewhere to move. And the stick is really around reviewing your partnership agreement and making sure that you have the right tools in there to protect against partners who may be thinking about leaving or have left. And that means things like ensuring that you have sufficiently long notice periods in there to ensure that it gives you enough time to embed the team and the clients if a partner does give notice, and ensuring that your restrictive covenants, if you have them, are enforceable and of the right length of time so that they are enforceable. Ensuring that you have garden leave provisions in so that if a key partner does serve notice, you can put them in the garden for a while you kind of ensure that you are kind of speaking to the clients and the people and ensuring that you're able to transition those clients and the team to the other partners in the firm. And increasingly, I'm seeing, especially at the larger firm spectrum, that firms are looking at putting into their partnership agreements good bad leaver provisions so that there are consequences for partners who decide to leave to go to a competitor and take clients or people with them, that they could end up losing significant amounts in terms of their current account balances, unpaid profit distributions effectively, and even their capital as a result of kind of breaching their covenants to the firm. But I think the real challenge is not kind of drafting these protections into your partnership agreements. It's actually persuading partners that those protections are legitimate and proportionate in order to kind of protect the long-term interests of the firm. And actually some of the difficult conversations among partnerships when management teams kind of propose these provisions can be actually getting them approved by the partners. And we've seen some kind of cases where actually partners have decided it's not something they want to do.
I would say that having a good, clear garden leave provision is very useful, and exercising it, because having the partners who are looking to move or who are being exited out of the way, not dealing with clients, not talking to their colleagues and potentially persuading them to make a move, is a better position for a firm to be in than sort of trying to shore things up after the event. And looks, I think, to your point about where these things are being introduced, partners saying, well, do we really want restrictions in our agreement? Would I want to be restricted when I leave, and so on? Garden leave seems less of an onerous type of restriction, but it is a very powerful one. Also, I think having the express ability to require partners to provide information to the firm, to answer questions, so that if the firm has suspicions about some sort of misconduct, where someone is talking to their clients about moving with them when they shouldn't be, or talking to associates or the partners and so on, the partner is actually under an express duty to provide that information. And that can put them in a very difficult position. And that's one of the hardest things to deal with when you're a partner who's perhaps leaving, looking to move, and has been doing something that you shouldn't have been. Because if you're given a direct question that you really can't comfortably answer, it can make things very awkward for them, and they then have to start dancing around the question or provide information that they clearly don't want to have to provide, which can be quite useful to the firm. So having that type of provision in there is very powerful. Also see quite a lot these days the ability for a firm to withhold sums from the partner where they have some sort of reasonable belief or suspicion that there's been a breach of some obligation by the partner. Typically what that then means is that they turn to a provision in the agreement that says, well, we don't have to pay you all your capital back, or we can withhold distributions, whatever it might be, and we can rely on this provision, and you're not complying with our requests to provide information and so on, and we regard that as being evidence to us of some sort of breach. What that does, it leaves the partner having to go after the firm to recover the money, which is a good position for the firm to be in. It doesn't really have to do anything other than just hang on to the partner's money. Restricted covenants can still be very effective. Typically these days in LP agreements and partnership agreements, we don't see pure non-competition restrictions, so something that would prevent a partner joining a competing firm. It is still usual to see restrictions around soliciting or dealing with clients, or soliciting other partners or employees the partner has worked with. The difficulty with those is that often pressure can be brought by clients on the firm to say, well, look, we want to move with this partner, you should release him from the covenant, and so on. But it can still cause a good degree of uncertainty and put the firm in a good position to negotiate with the partner or the firm that they're joining to get some sort of commercial deal when the partner leaves and tries to take clients with them. And the point as well, I think, about the sort of good leaver, bad leaver provisions, many firms now will say that if you decide to leave within a certain period of having been paid, say, a particular bonus or some other sort of distribution, then you have to repay that. That can be quite a good deterrent for partners, albeit, of course, if they're joining a firm that's very keen to have them, very often that firm will be happy to pay whatever it is that the partner will lose. So it's I think of limited value in lots of cases with partners, but it still can be effective.
Yeah, those are all really great points. Thank you, David. Lisa, the picture is very different in the US, isn't it? And the US kind of bar restrictions on some of these protections that firms are used to having in the UK market are very different, and then which is why we don't see US law firm partnership agreements having notice periods longer than 30 days, for example, and certainly no restrictive covenants, because the principle of the client should be able to choose, and they should be able to choose to go with the partner if they wish to. So what are the protections that the US firms can have?
Very little. So there's much less friction in moving from firm to firm in the US. And I mean, a couple of the things that firms are doing, and I think firms are looking at this because it obviously is becoming more of an issue. There are some firms that have notice periods, and I've seen them up to 3 months, but it's not garden leave. So that makes a big difference in terms of, David, as you point out, in garden leave situation, people are not able to work and not interacting with the client, these notice periods mean they just have to stay at the firm for, whether it's 30 days or 3 months, but they're still working with the client. So there's no interruption in their relationship with the client. So that doesn't really have that much of an impact. We do see extending return of capital. So, it might, if a partner leaves to go to a competitor, the return of capital might be over a 5-year period instead of a 1 or a 2-year period. But again, they're generally getting it back. They're just getting it back more slowly. We don't see clawback of compensation, although I think firms are looking at whether they can they do try to push the payment of bonuses out to usually April, so that because most U.S. firms are on a calendar year, and so they push it out for 3 or 4 months, and then by that time people are sort of already invested in the following year. So they try to push out the actual distribution of money as much as possible. But given that it's a cash basis, it's hard to really hold money or defer bonuses till later in the year, because partners are having to pay tax on it earlier. Beyond that, I mean, it used to be that firms would withhold retirement benefits. There used to be firm-funded retirement benefits for partners. But so many firms have gotten rid of those plans that that's no longer a factor. There's a few, but essentially, so you'd forego your rights to the firm-funded retirement benefits if you don't actually retire from the firm. But that only really applies at this point to a handful of firms that still have firm-funded plans. So that really it doesn't apply in most situations. So there's really not that much that U.S. firms can do right now.
It's really interesting insights. I have some conversations sometimes with our US clients about, whether they should be thinking of a different approach in London, because their London office will usually be structured through a different entity for regulatory reasons. So it's possible that they could certainly apply a different regime to their UK qualified partners who are not US attorneys and not subject to US bar regulations. But often the kind of sticking point is that most of the US firms want to use a one firm approach, and it does seem fundamentally unfair for if you are kind of holding yourself as being one firm to treat one group of partners because they're in London differently to your US based partners. And that's the kind of dichotomy that firms will grapple with those questions. But it is theoretically possible for the US firm to treat their UK solicitor partners differently to their US partners, the US attorneys. But I don't see that happen very often at all.
No, and I wonder, as firms, some of the US branch offices in London get significantly larger, and some of them are at this point, a couple hundred plus lawyers, then that might start to shift, because that they will be meaningful offices. When it's a 30 or 40 lawyer office, then it probably doesn't make sense to single out the partners in that office with a different partnership agreement.
Great. Well, I'd like to close here. This has been a really fantastic, interesting conversation. Thank you both so much for sharing all of your insights, especially Lisa. It's been really interesting to hear about what's going on in the US market. Certainly the UK law firms are always watching what the US law firms are doing and how that's going to affect us in London. So it's been really fantastic to hear that from you. But I wanted to kind of pull back as a kind of final closing question to the kind of strategic question for firms. So the firms that want to kind of be successful in this quite very difficult competitive market won't simply be the firms that kind of pay the most. From our discussion, it's clear that there's a variety of things that make firms successful and retain people and attract the right high flyers, and at the same time kind of protect the kind of culture and the partnership that they're trying to kind of build or kind of preserve. Lisa, I wanted to kind of ask you the final question around, obviously there's been a kind of a recent wave of merger activity between the UK and the US firms, and I know you've been involved with a few of those, which sounded incredibly interesting. But how do you think that's kind of affecting remuneration and lateral movement and partner expectations at the moment?
Yeah, and I think some of it depends on whether it's the firm is weighted more to the UK, Europe versus the US, and we've seen mergers on both sides of that equation. But I think there's a couple of things. I do think that we see firms looking to develop a single compensation structure that works across the globe, and encourages cross jurisdiction collaboration. So that really is the primary focus. I think firms are trying to make sure that they can actually take advantage of the business case of having a global firm, and not just have a sort of internal referral relationship. It needs to be an opportunity to actually work together and handle cross-border matters. And I think there's a recognition that compensation needs to be competitive in the local market. And so whatever that local market is, which may mean that the US, for example, may have a higher proportion of higher paid partners because that's the dynamic of that market versus another. So I think there is a sort of recognition that that's going to be required in order to retain the top talent in each jurisdiction. So I think those are the things that are coming up most frequently in the discussions around remuneration in some of these cross-border mergers. And, we've had a couple, I think, 3 or 4 or 5 that have just been effective in the last year or so. And I think those are all still works in progress in terms of how they're handling compensation. But I do think I think all of them have been financially integrated mergers, as opposed to a Varian structure. And so that does bring with it some additional complications and opportunity to really create a cohesive comp approach that ensures that they can deliver on that business case.
Really interesting. Thank you, Lisa, and very exciting to see what's going to be happening going forward in kind of cross-border consolidation. Well, thank you both again. It's been fantastic discussing these issues with you, and I hope our listeners really enjoyed it as much as I did. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact any of us. We'd be happy to have a chat with you. And if you enjoyed this, please check out our website. We have lots of other podcasts on these issues as well, if you'd like to check those out. And that leaves me to thank you, Lisa and David, again, and thank our audience, and hope to see you again soon.